Everyone said that the eldest lady of the Pansy family was a madman. Basil Maggie, who has been with me since I was a child, was called by me as a dog. But there are always people who want to grab things from crazy people. The illegitimate daughter deliberately locked me in the utility room to make me miss the show, and wanted to hand him a love letter backstage. And I looked at Basil Maggie, who broke into the utility room. Will you betray your master? Basil Maggie bowed her head obediently. I will always be the eldest latest person. At the same time, I heard his heart. I want to be the eldest latest dog, but I was locked up by the eldest lady. Look, Basil Maggie is working as a cow and a horse for Sarah Pansy again. Be quiet, don't let her hear. I sat on the steps next to the basketball court with a clean coat underneath me. I listened to the sound of small discussions coming into my ears. In front of me was Basil Maggie running towards me with a bottle of grape soda. He was tall and long-legged, but he came to me in just a few steps. Unscrew the cap neatly and hand it to me. I avoided his hand and held the bottom of the drink, frowning. It's not orange. It's not in the freezer, Basil Maggie said as she pulled out a bag of orange gummies from her pocket. The last bag, I snatched. With that, he stared at me with dark eyes, like a dog that silently invites merit. I raised my eyebrows and flipped my palm. He tacitly let go in mid-air, and the gummy fell into my palm. There was no physical contact at all times. I took a sip of my soda and stood up. Let's go. Then he lifted his feet and left. Basil Maggie grabbed her coat and followed me. Around the corner of the school building, suddenly, a reckless girl rushed towards her. I subconsciously grabbed the other person's arm. For a moment, her heart rang in my ears. It's Sarah Pansy. This madman hates people touching her the most. She won't let Basil Maggie hit me. Right. It's really unfortunate to run into this neurosis. Are you all right? Basil Maggie's slightly eager voice muffled her steady stream of complaints. I let go of my hand with a blank face. It's okay. The girl on the other side opened her lips, as if she wanted to apologize. I staggered and walked straight forward, too lazy to look at her inconsistent appearance. After walking only a few meters, I looked back at Basil Maggie. In a nutshell, he said, hands. Basil Maggie consciously reached out and handed it to me. I grabbed his wrist and walked on. The eldest lady was in a bad mood for the first time today. I knew that I would go outside school to buy orange soda. Can you hold it a little longer today? Listening to his voice one after another, my originally troubled thoughts gradually settled down. For as long as I can remember, I've found myself hearing people's hearts through physical contact. When I was younger, I used it as my special ability. It has been used to peek into the hearts of many people. However, those surging voices like a tide can swallow up all false appearances, making people clearly feel the countless dark sides of this world. I'm a madman. I put the snake I caught on the servant's bed, because at night when she told me bedtime stories, she kept calling me a troublesome fool in her heart. Also used a chair to smash the schoolboy's head and bleed, for he deliberately tripped me up, and took me in his arms, and I heard the unbearable lust in the eyes of all. I'm just a psychopath who can go crazy, and hurt people for no apparent reason. Perhaps the most profound feeling that I am a madman. It was me who spent the whole night with my dead mother. It is said that, when he was found, he was covered in blood, but he did not cry, or make trouble. I had just turned 12 years old. The hand holding Basil Maggie tightened tighter and tighter, and her fingertips turned white, until I heard him say in his heart, the eldest lady holds it so tightly. I let go of it as if I had just woken up from a dream. At the same time, he also keenly caught a flash of loss in Basil Maggie's expression. I ignored it, all the way back to the classroom. Many people are bored playing with their phones in their seats. At a glance, I saw that Basil Maggie had an extra bottle of drink in her seat. Walk over and take a closer look. There is also a post-it note pressed underneath. Brother Basil Maggie, be kind to yourself. It was signed by Dora Pansy. A childish and ridiculous smiley face is also drawn on the back. Basil Maggie apparently saw both, too. The next second, he picked up the drink and threw it to Lucas, who was sitting in front of him. Here you go, Lucas continued. Thank you, Brother Basil Maggie. Then he crumpled the post-it notes into a ball and tossed them around. An arc is drawn in the air, and falls precisely into the trash can. I sat down, looked at Basil Maggie next to me, and said slowly, am I bad for you? Basil Maggie leaned her head over, her dark eyes locked tightly on me. The eldest lady is very good to me. I smiled in satisfaction and raised my hand to rub his head. Good. Basil Maggie curled her lips contentedly. The eldest lady looks so good when she laughs. Today, Friday, is the day to go back to Pansy's house? As soon as I walked out of the school gate, there was something that didn't look long to ruin my interest. Dora Pansy suddenly appeared in front of us, smiling coquettishly. Brother Basil Maggie, wait for me. The sweet voice made me frown. Basil Maggie had a hint of anger in her eyes, and her thin lips opened slightly. Get out. When Dora Pansy heard this, she immediately looked at him, with tears in her eyes. My driver didn't pick me up today. As she spoke, she glanced at me timidly. If Sister Sarah Pansy doesn't like me, I'd better walk back. We had walked to the car as she spoke. I turned around, looked at her indifferently, and asked, "Want to go back with us?" Dora Pansy nodded, looking at Basil Maggie expectantly. I sneered, "Yes." Then he raised his chin at Basil Maggie. "Go. Stuff her in the trunk." Without hesitation, Basil Maggie turned around and knocked on the driver's window. The window was lowered, and he said to the driver, "Open the trunk." Dora Pansy looked at us in panic, took a few steps back, and his face turned a little pale. She shook her head and stammered, "No, no, I'll call a car to pick me up." I sneered at the look she looked, no longer looking at her, beckoned Basil Maggie to get in the car, and walked away. Back at Pansy's house, his father, Jean Dorothy, sat on the couch. Dora Pansy has also arrived home. He was sitting next to him at the moment. His eyes were red, and he had obviously filed a complaint. Jean Dorothy's eyes widened when he saw us enter. "How did you get Dora Pansy back alone?" I bowed my head slightly, not saying a word. Dora Pansy spoke out at the right time, sobbing pitifully. "Dad, my sister seems to hate me very much, and said that she would put me in the trunk." Jean Dorothy was furious. "Scoop up the ashtray on the coffee table, and smash it at me." The sharp sound of breaking the air intertwined with the muffled snort of the person in front of him. I looked at Basil Maggie, who stood in front of me at some point, and there was a fleeting coldness in my eyes. Jean Dorothy looked at me coldly. "Dora Pansy is your sister. If something like this happens again, you will get out of Pansy's house for me." I sneered in my heart. An illegitimate daughter who has just been found is also worthy of being my sister. But his face was not obvious, and he nodded in response. "Dad, I know." Dora Pansy was taken back to Pansy's house after the college entrance examination. At my 20th birthday party, Jean Dorothy announced that she was the second lady of the Pansy family. The guests were in an uproar. Who doesn't know that when the Pansy family and the Goss family were married, Olivia Goss, the eldest lady of the Goss family, only gave birth to such a daughter as me. Olivia Goss committed suicide when I was 12. Such a second lady who is 2 years younger than me can only be the illegitimate daughter of Jean Dorothy raised outside. Only I know that Dora Pansy is not an outcast. She is the child of Jean Dorothy and his first love, Betty Dorothy. However, paper can't hide the fire after all. When my mother found out about this, she used the cooperation between the two families as a threat to force Betty Dorothy and her daughter to leave the country. Not even Jean Dorothy was able to track their whereabouts. It wasn't until Betty Dorothy's death that Dora Pansy returned to find her biological father and returned to her ancestors. One is the product of true love, and the other is the product of marriage. It is natural to see who you prefer and who you hate. I turned my head and glanced at Basil Maggie, who was bleeding from his forehead. He picked up my gaze and followed me to the second floor. Entering my room, I pulled over a chair and sat down. Basil Maggie knelt neatly on one knee and looked up at me. "Don't be angry, miss. It'll be over soon." My wet eyes filled my reflection, completely oblivious to my bleeding wounds. I glanced at him and got up to get the medicine kit. When the cool iodopher touched the wound, Basil Maggie let out a soft hiss. Seeing this, I let go of my strength. After taking the pills, Basil Maggie continued to move as before. I squinted at him slightly. "Who allowed you to stand in my way?" Basil Maggie's eyes twinkled when she heard the displeasure in my words. The hand tentatively rested on my knee. Watching his movements, I didn't react. I hate anyone's touch. Even Basil Maggie was asked not to touch me on her own initiative. Now he is becoming more and more presumptuous. Seeing that I did not reject it, he had to lean his head up inch by inch. thin but sharp eyes lifted and stared straight at me. It's my instinct to protect Miss. At this moment, he said in his heart, the eldest lady is caring about me. Basil Maggie likes the eldest lady the most. The doll should of course like the owner. I gently stroked his smooth hair, my fingertips running down his stiff, smooth silhouette. It's like playing with a delicate object, or pet a loyal dog with its head down. Before I was 12, I barely went out of the house. All homework is taken care of by the home teacher. Suddenly, one day, the maids at home noticed that I had become very little talkative, and did not communicate with others. When Jean Dorothy found out about this, he thought I was just withdrawn, and didn't like to communicate with people. So they asked me to take me to an orphanage, and pick a playmate for myself. I was dressed up as a princess-like doll. Was led by Leah's mother in the orphanage? At the same time, I also heard Leah's mother's voice. I want to see, who is unlucky, staying with a crazy child every day, and if you are not crazy, you have to be played to death by her. I let go of her hand, walk up to a row of children, one by one, touch their wrists. If only she could choose me. Her family looks so rich. Why didn't she speak? Is she as mute as Zai Ogwang? Why did you touch us? Is she insane? I only get bored listening to the messy voices, until I held a skinny hand. She's like a princess, so beautiful. I looked up and met a pair of inky eyes. I stared intently at the boy in front of me, fair-skinned, weak, and a slender neck that seems to be pinched with one hand. With just one look, I was sure it would be mine. I let go of my hand, and looked back at Mama Leo, pointing my finger at the boy. And just like that, I took Basil Maggie back to Pansy's house. In the first year we were together, we had little verbal communication. I barely speak voluntarily. Basil Maggie isn't a talkative either. Usually we just sit together and listen to our tutor give us a lesson. The rest of the time, I did my thing, with Basil Maggie by my side. Even if I did something uncanny from time to time, he would never look at me with the eyes of a madman. For example, when I threw the bowl brought by the servant on the floor again, the soup spilled all over the floor. Basil Maggie gently pushed the door open, and crouched down on the edge of the bed. Under my cold eyes, he handed me his hand and held it. It's a habit I've developed during the year he's been at Pansy's house. Every time I hear the malicious voices of the people around me, I can't help but peek into Basil Maggie's heart, confirm over and over again that he will not betray me, like those dolls who can't speak and don't have a voice. At this moment, I heard him say, "Don't let others come up and disturb the eldest lady." However, the eldest lady is very well behaved when she is angry. His eyelashes flickered a few times, and a hand behind his back suddenly reached out to me. I fixed my eyes on it. It's a fluffy doll pendant, my favorite character. He asked softly, "Do you like it?" I didn't answer, just took the pendant and held it firmly in my hand. The hand holding him was getting harder and harder. I stared at him for a moment. After a while, he told him in an unquestionable tone, "You're my doll too." Basil Maggie was stunned for a second, then the corners of his mouth curled, and his eyes were full of pleasure. "Yes, I'm the eldest latest doll." Heavy rain poured down with lightning and thunder. I curled up on the bed, staring sideways at the glowing lamp at the head of the bed. "Count down silently in your heart. 10, 9, 3, 2, 1. The door didn't open. Basil Maggie didn't come. This is the first time. My doll is not well behaved. I sat up and stepped on the carpet barefoot. The door was opened, and Dora Pansy was entered, dressed in a nightdress. She stood in the doorway of Basil Maggie's room, and stopped him with open arms. "The figure is crumbling and pitiful. Brother Basil Maggie, can you just stay with me for a while? I'm really scared of thunder." Basil Maggie's arm clutching the doorknob appeared, apparently impatient. "But I don't want to touch Dora Pansy, who is dressed in a cool outfit," he only said sharply. "Get out of here." Dora Pansy didn't let go of his mouth when he saw that he was alive or dead, so she simply went straight to grab Basil Maggie's wrist. Basil Maggie suddenly looked in my direction. I didn't notice her movements for a moment. His pupils suddenly shrank as he felt the touch on his wrist. Didn't care about any upbringing? So he just shook off Dora Pansy's hand and pushed her hard. Dora Pansy exclaimed and staggered back a few steps. Basil Maggie walked briskly up to me. His gaze swept over my bare feet, and his brow furrowed. He bent down slightly, intending to pick me up. I stepped back, avoiding his touch. Basil Maggie froze, and her face turned pale in an instant, and I looked directly at Dora Pansy, who was crying aggrieved. His gaze swept across every inch of her bare skin. Then he said, word by word, "Don't touch my things." Dora Pansy shrank and hurriedly defended, "Sister, I just came to this house and was too scared." "Then you don't have to be afraid to get out of this house." I threw it down, ignored the two behind me, and went straight back to my room. A few knocks rang out, and the doorknob turned. The figure of Basil Maggie came into my sight. I sat at the head of the bed, my gaze sweeping over his wrist, that had been touched by Dora Pansy. The originally white wrist was now red. "You can see how hard he's cleaned it." Basil Maggie took a few steps, and sat down cross-legged on the carpet, with his right hand on the edge of the bed. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me. "It's clean, it's not dirty." As he spoke, the grievances in his eyes were self-evident. I leaned close to him, my fingertips climbing his distinct silhouette. "The eldest lady is angry because of her again. I want to kill that woman right now." I twisted my fingertips, pinched his jaw hard, and said coldly, "I said I didn't say it. Don't let those messy people touch you." Basil Maggie's eyes glowed with imperceptible water, and there was also a bottomless confusion. "I said it. I should just close the door and wait for her to leave before coming back to the eldest lady. Sarah Pansy don't want me." I scoffed and let go of him. I was so anxious that I didn't even call the eldest lady. I know I shouldn't be angry with him. He was in a hurry to find me, and was taken advantage of by Dora Pansy. But I'm crazy. How can my dolls be touched by people I hate? It's still a doll that is reluctant to throw away even if it gets dirty. Okay, let's not take an example. I scooped up an original English novel from the bedside, and threw it into his arms. Nyan. Basil Maggie breathed a clear sigh of relief, but didn't speak. Instead, he leaned his head over and looked at me expectantly. I frowned and scolded, "Trouble," but she still rubbed it indiscriminately on top of his head. Only then did he bow his head contentedly, and open the book. Fluent English came out of his mouth slowly. I slipped into the quilt and closed my eyes. The voice of Basil Maggie just now echoed in his head. "I will always love Miss Love." This isn't the first time I've heard him say the word, love. The doll to the owner can be liked. What about love? I was puzzled by this, but I didn't think about it. A deep, magnetic voice mingles with the sound of wind and rain crashing against the window. Once again, I had a rainstorm night without nightmares. Back to school on Monday, I was in full swing in the rehearsals for the orientation party. Because I hated everything that worked with people, I signed up for a piano solo. I played the piano music intently, my fingertips jumping and spinning, immersing myself in it. At the end of the song, I slowly withdrew my hand. When I looked up, Basil Maggie was standing at the door of the practice room, staring intently at me. I looked at him from afar and asked, "Is it pretty?" Basil Maggie immediately nodded. "Beautiful." "I didn't ask you." I looked behind him. Dora Pansy stood there like a hibiscus out of the water, her white dress fluttering in the wind. The fawn-like eyes were stared at by me like this, and I blinked innocently twice. My sister plays really well, and I also report a piano solo, so I will definitely not be as good as my sister when the time comes. Basil Maggie turned her head and frowned at her, and walked quickly over to me, and stood still. I closed the lid slowly and methodically, and earnestly advised her, "Then don't go up and be embarrassed." Dora Pansy choked, her face gloomy for a moment, and then quickly returned to normal. Although I don't have the conditions of my sister to learn piano from a young age, I still want to challenge myself. With that, she looked at Basil Maggie expectantly, as if to make Basil Maggie appreciate her coquettish appearance. Basil Maggie didn't even look at her. I chuckled. "I wish you success." As I left the practice room, I passed Dora Pansy. "Slut, sooner or later you won't be complacent." Sure enough, the voice of the annoying person is a ruin. I grabbed Basil Maggie's wrist and left without looking back. The welcome party came as scheduled. Early in the morning, I woke up in my off-campus apartment, and picked out a long black dress in my closet. There was a knock on the door. I straightened the tie around my waist, and didn't lift my head. "Come in." Basil Maggie's almost bewitching face appears in the mirror. He held a velvety jewelry box in his hand, and brought it to me. I glanced faintly and asked, "What is it?" Basil Maggie didn't mean to take it, and she didn't get annoyed, so she opened the jewelry box directly. A dazzling ruby necklace emerges. I saw it by chance before, and I feel that it is very suitable for the eldest lady." As he spoke, he took out his necklace, and looked at me expectantly. I hesitated for 2 seconds and stroked my long hair. "Put it on for me." Basil Maggie's face was palpably happy. "Stand behind me, bow your head, and wrap the necklace around my neck." His gaze was focused and reverent. "It's as if I'm the artwork itself, and the necklace is just an embellishment." The warm breath swept against the back of his neck, causing a tingling. Faced with a strange feeling for no apparent reason, I frowned a little puzzled. Asked the question I had overlooked, "What is love?" Basil Maggie paused as she paused her hands, and looked up at us in the mirror. At the moment, we are very close. From the perspective of the mirror, it was as if he was holding me from behind, and burying it deep in my neck. Basil Maggie's Adam's apple rolls, and her dark eyes seemed to devour me. Love is the possession of one and the surrender of the other. I'm still wondering. Like us. He looked at me with a good look and finally nodded. "Then I love you too." I came to this conclusion with ease. A doll wants to be loved by its owner, so why can't he satisfy him? Basil Maggie lowered her eyes. There was silence for a few seconds, before continuing the movement of his hand. Cool fingertips rubbed over exposed skin. I heard him say, "The eldest lady doesn't understand it now, but she will understand it later." He was also heard saying, "Anyway, the person next to the eldest lady will only be me." 18. The welcome party is about to start. Xiao Zhang, who was in charge of logistics, ran into the lounge in a panic. Seeing me, it was like grasping at a life-saving straw. "Sister Sarah Pansy, the piano is out of order, and now there is only one spare piano. Why don't you go and see if you can adapt to it?" I frowned slightly and put down the lipstick I had just applied. He stood up and said, "I'll take a look." Xiao Zhang led the way in front and went against the flow of people. Walking to the utility room, she gently pushed the door open. "It's inside. Sister Sarah Pansy, take a look first." I stepped inside, only to hear the door slamming behind me. The utility room was plunged into darkness. I staggered to fumble for the doorknob, only to find that the door had been locked from the outside. A man's name popped into my mind. Dora Pansy. She is the only one who loves to play these little tricks. But I don't have the heart to think about it at the moment. I gasped for breath and fell to my knees uncontrollably. Cold sweat slid down and there was a buzz in my ears. All the senses are pulling me back a few years ago. The engulfing darkness swept in. "Slut." The sound of whipping through the air was mixed with the woman's shrill roar. Severe pain is accompanied by endless numbness. I prostrate on the ground, struggling to lift my eyes. The room was full of darkness, with only sporadic candle flames dancing and burning. I don't know how long it took, and a muffled sound fell to the ground. The woman knelt down in front of me as if she had gone mad, grabbed me by my tattered clothes and asked hysterically, "Why didn't he come back? Did he go to that little slut again? I asked you to call him. Why didn't he come back?" She slapped me hard as she spoke. Sharp fingertips cut through the skin, and a burning sting pain came from the face. "Useless things. Even your dad can't keep them." I looked at her with a dying breath, and my fingers poked forward. Her lips were open and bleeding, and she called out angrily, "Mommy." Hearing the words was another crisp slap in the face. The woman's eyes were scarlet and she roared, "Don't call me Mom. Your dad doesn't want us anymore, and soon he'll let someone else be your mom." I slowly withdrew my hand, and looked at the beautiful but distorted face. The woman stood up angrily after she had finished her breath. After a long time, she calmed down and coldly threw down a sentence. "When you're sick, when you're coming out, come out and call him, and ask him to come back and see you." I watched as the red heels faded away, the heavy door opening and closing. At only 10 years old, I just thought it was a gift. Waiting is nothing more than physical pain. I didn't understand it at the time. Why does that mother always lock me in this world when that person puts her arms around me, and laughs and calls me good? Wait until the candle burns out. Wait until darkness falls. But she said she loved me. She told me that love is possession and torture. Everything that belongs to you must be firmly grasped in your hands. Even if that thing was covered with spikes and the palm was dripping with blood, it couldn't let go for a moment. But she also told me with practical actions. After all, you can't hold what is not your own. It was a stormy night. Scattered on the floor were one photograph after another, showing men and women naked, extremely lingering. I sat on my knees with a heavy chain wrapped around my hands. My mother's nails were digging deep into my thin shoulders, and laughing sickly and crazy. Even if I sent the woman away, he wouldn't look at me. Anyone can do it, but I can't. It's just me. A teardrop slid down the corner of her eye, and her face was sad, more like a tortured person than a numb look. She was staring at me with burning eyes. After a dead silence, she leaned over and hugged me. My mother's warm embrace gave me the illusion of spring outside, but I clearly heard her say, "I hate him. I hate you." In the next second, the sound of a sharp weapon piercing the flesh sounded in my ears. I tried to look down, but she held me tightly. In a suppressed mad voice, he whispered to me, "Sarah Pansy, Mommy's good daughter, you have to hate him with me, and don't let him have a good time when you grow up." I looked at her side face in amazement, delicate and beautiful, but those eyes, which were always slightly raised, became extremely hollow until she slipped to the ground. I saw blood red in my eyes, flowing out of her body, winding to my feet, like a cold poisonous snake, spitting scarlet snake letters, all the way up, crawling all over my body, entanglement and tightening, until the last moment of the death of the prey, will live forever in the fear of suffocation. I understood that this was my mother's punishment for me. The next day, a servant broke in, seeing the tragic situation in the room. A piercing scream alarmed everyone in the villa. According to eyewitnesses, my hands were handcuffed behind my back, but like a baby, she snuggled up in her mother's arms. Even if it was a stiff corpse, if it weren't for the coagulated blood, and the pale face of the mother, it might have been a heartwarming scene. Some say it's my cold-blooded monster. My mother died before my eyes, but I didn't struggle. I didn't cry for help. I didn't cry. Instead, he was able to sleep peacefully in her arms. I was puzzled. I was just touching her, trying to hear her. It turns out that my mother also has such a quiet side. There was no monstrous hatred in my heart, and there was no insult to me. Some are just a pure embrace. It was the embrace I had longed for a long time but couldn't get. It was much later that I fully understood the story between my parents. The two are world friends. Jean Dorothy and Olivia Goss were married from a little finger, childhood sweethearts. Jean Dorothy took great care of her, telling her more than once that he would marry her back home. In Olivia Goss's eyes, they will talk about a vigorous love affair in the future, and then step into the marriage hall together. It wasn't until her junior year of high school that a new transfer student, Betty Dorothy, shattered her vision of a bright future. Jean Dorothy fell in love with this quiet and shy girl, and fell in love without hesitation. When Olivia Goss notices their anomaly after graduating from high school, Jean Dorothy is already in a relationship with Betty Dorothy. So she found Pansy's parents and told the whole story. Under pressure from Pansy's parents, Jean Dorothy and Betty Dorothy were forced to break up, and quickly got engaged to Olivia Goss. Graduating from college, get married right away. Jean Dorothy may have hated and resented Olivia Goss, but it's a foregone conclusion. Even for the sake of the interests of the two families, they have to play a loving couple with Olivia Goss. After I was born, they had a warm time. Olivia Goss also thought she had won the man's heart once and for all. However, all illusions were easily torn apart by my words. By that time, Olivia Goss was already crazy. She thought that her husband was competent, and her first love rekindled. And she even had a 2-year-old child outside. She became irritable and frantically questioned Jean Dorothy, even used all means to send Betty Dorothy's mother and daughter away. Jean Dorothy never returned home after that. Even when I was forced to call him again and again, I always got a string of busy signals. So Olivia Goss hated him, hated until he died, holding intimate photos of him and other women in his hands. Olivia Goss hates me too. Hate to die in front of me. Punish me for revealing the truth in the first place. I lived in endless hatred all along. Chains are entangled, and there is no peace. Miss Sarah Pansy. I huddled in the corner and heard an urgent cry in my ears, struggling to break away from my heavy eyelids. Basil Maggie appeared in front of me. He was short of breath and stared at me with an anxious face. He had seen me suffocated by the darkness. At that time, he panicked to the extreme, picked me up, and rushed to the hospital. At this moment, his hands trembled and tried to touch me, but he withdrew it, as if afraid of breaking the fragile items in front of you. I sat against the hard, cold wall, put one hand on his cheek and patted it twice. The voice was hoarse and harsh. Will you betray your master? This action seemed to turn on the switch in his body. He bowed his head obediently. A pair of big strong hands wrapped around my waist, and pressed me into my arms. Choked up but replied firmly, I'll always be the eldest lady. Warm, moist drips down my neck. Basil Maggie will never betray the miss. I listened to his heart at the same time. I want to be the eldest latest dog, but I was locked up by the eldest lady. I was firmly held by him, dispelling the coldness from my body. Outside of his sight, pathology and paranoia spread in his eyes. I stroked his hair one by one, controlling the excitement and madness of the clamor in his heart. He said in a non-fluctuating tone, I'm almost ready. Let's get those things out. I think Mother and Basil Maggie were right. Love is possession. If you can't possess it, then destroy it. Here's how the local news describes a tumultuous November. The Pansy family in Bikang was turned upside down overnight. Chairman Jean Dorothy was openly arrested in a sexual venue, and multiple incriminating evidence was exposed at the same time. The second lady of Pansy's family is suspected of enrolling in a university as someone else, and a case has been filed for investigation. Sarah Pansy, the eldest lady of the Pansy family, succeeded as the chairman of the Dorothy family group by vigorously suppressing a number of shareholders who had complained about it. Basil Maggie sat at the dining table, reading the news with all her opinions. I was slowly slicing through the steak, blood dripping down my knife and fork onto the plate. I lifted my eyelids and glanced at him. You're idle. Basil Maggie put down her phone and looked at me, with a brow of eyebrows. The most important thing is for the eldest lady to relieve her anger. Naturally, he is not idle. Over the years, the people I sent out to collect incriminating evidence, and he is the only person I feel most comfortable with, and the old foxes on the board are all in the dark. Now that Dorothy's family has changed, he, as my confidant, will of course take care of all kinds of things for me. But right now, I have something more important. After eating my dinner unhurriedly, I stood up and called Basil Maggie. Come with me. Walking in the huge Pansy villa, it is like looking back on the first 20 years of my time. I was standing in the room at the end of the first floor. The key turned, and the door slowly opened. The room that had been dusty for years and no one had stepped on it was covered in dust. I turned my head to look at Basil Maggie and whispered, this room has been locked for almost 10 years. He obviously didn't expect me to bring him here, and there was confusion and doubt in his eyes. From the first day he entered Pansy's house, he was forbidden to go near this room, just because this is the place where the eldest lady of the Goss family committed suicide. No one has set foot since. I'm not taking him to see that, though. I walked slowly to the cloakroom. What was once a place full of elaborate dresses is now empty. A large mirror was in the middle, reflecting my slightly pale face at the moment. I raised my chin and motioned to Basil Maggie. Push it away. Basil Maggie was confused, but did so. The mirror moved easily to one side with his movements. The light in the room is enough to see the steps downward. Basil Maggie turned her head awkwardly, her eyes unconcealed with surprise. I skimmed him and descended the steps. I watched. The emaciated girl was dragged and walked step by step towards the abyss that belonged to her. Time coincides, and I stand in the maw of darkness. Basil Maggie alone broke in with a beam of light, blinding and intense. The blood stains in the basement had long since been washed away. I walked over to the couch and sat down. I don't care about the heavy dust on the top. They are a part of my life, whether they are dirty or bloody. Basil Maggie wanted to stop it, but seeing that I didn't care, he sat down with me. I reached out and grabbed his wrist as before. For as long as I can remember, this basement has been the place I've spent the most. My mother loved to sit here, and watch me get wrapped in chains and scarred, and kneel at her feet, struggling, pleading, and crying. The hand he was holding suddenly tensed, and the breathing on his side instantly increased. But his heart was blank, as if telling the story of someone else. I continued to say in a calm tone, she hated me for shattering her illusions of a happy family. Just because when I was 4 years old, I asked her who Betty Dorothy was and why Dad was going to see her. You may wonder, how a 4-year-old child can know that even she, the eldest lady of the Goss family, does not know. I chuckled lowly, laughter echoing through the emptiness. No, you're thinking about one right now. Why didn't I show up earlier? so that I could protect the eldest lady from an early age. How would the eldest lady know? All right, don't call me by name anymore. Basil. Maggie's body, who had not said a word all the time, stiffened suddenly, and even her hands trembled slightly. I relaxed my grip on him slightly. The tone seems to be reassuring, more like seduction. Don't be afraid. If you don't want me to hear it, you can break my hand away. Deathly silence spreads. I closed my eyes and held my breath. The next second, I fell into a warm embrace, like a gentle wind enveloping me tightly. Basil. Maggie will never betray the eldest lady. The eldest lady can confirm thousands of times. I listened to his pious voice, like the only believer of a god making an oath. I chuckled softly. Speak very slowly and gently. I always hear you say that you like me, even love me. I don't know what love is, but I want to possess you like a doll in a display case. Basil. Maggie's slightly rapid breathing swirled in my ears. I'm the eldest latest doll, and I always have been. His voice trembled slightly, as if panicked, as if he was afraid, but I listened to his heart. I'm the eldest latest doll, and I'm the eldest latest dog. I love Miss. I'm just as excited as I'm a madman. It seems to be aware of what he has exposed. Basil. Maggie tried to back away, but I held on to her tightly. I asked, are you scared? Basil. Maggie hugged me again, her head buried deep in my neck socket. A muffled voice came out. Don't be afraid. I just want to be the eldest latest dog. As he spoke, he rubbed his furry head against it, and it was really a vicious dog that bowed his head. I stroked him as always. Those who offer their loyalty in the endless darkness cannot see the pathological madness in the eyes of the gods. Naturally, there is no way to know about this sudden confession. In such a place of decay and sin, it is clearly the low of the devil. Language, never betraying, is not an oath, but a curse. What I want is that he has always taken the initiative to put on the shackles, and they will never be unbroken. Basil. Maggie didn't try to teach me to love people. He is still my shadow. No matter what path I take, he is always there for me. If he hadn't come to my room every night, I think that's going to be more convincing. At this moment, I looked at the man who was lying next to my bed and refused to leave, and quietly pushed his head. He rubbed my hand. I'll tell the eldest lady a bedtime story. I didn't let go. There's no rain tonight. No need. His starry eyes flickered. I need to, or I won't be able to sleep. Looking at his tricky appearance, I sighed deeply. More and more there is no way to take him where he wants to tell bedtime stories. It is clearly a bad intention. I also kissed the eldest lady today. The eldest lady is so soft. I was kissed to the point of vertigo and my brain was starved of oxygen. A kick kicked the man who had climbed into bed at some point. However, he fell to the ground and grabbed my ankle first. My breath was still unsteady, and I let out a sneer. Dolls don't kiss their masters. Basil. Maggie sat on the carpet, her fingertips gently rubbing the protruding knuckles of my ankles, and smiled innocently. But I'm my master's dog. Dogs are the ones who lick their owners. I looked at his obsessive expression and browned my eyebrows. Ever since he learned my secret, he has completely stopped hiding it. Every day, my heart is chattering and arguing. There was even a video conference, where he pinched my fingertips under the table, rubbed and twisted slowly. These people talk nonsense, and the eldest lady is so serious. Miss, look at me. I'm better looking than them. I glanced at it. He let go pitifully and waited honestly. When the meeting was over, he immediately pounced, still looking at me with those seductive eyes. Isn't it time for me to make amends? I laughed, picked his chin, and dropped a watery kiss on my lips. In a split second, he had to wrap himself up inch by inch, pry open the lip gate and poke into the territory, extremely gentle and restrictive. At this moment, I thought, I don't understand what love has to do with it. Basil. Maggie and I are two companion plants, and unless they wither, they will die entangled. Basil. Maggie extra. The first time I saw the eldest lady was in an orphanage. She was dressed in an intricate dress, and every strand of her hair was exquisite, like a princess descending. And I was wearing ill-fitting clothes that covered up all kinds of bruises and scars on my body. She was standing in front of our row of children. One by one, he took their wrists, but kept his head down, until she took my hand. Those clear eyes looked straight into my heart. All of a sudden, I couldn't even breathe. That day, she raised her hand and pointed at me. and I was adopted by the Pansy family. She won't understand what kind of redemption this is for an orphan who has been bullied and scolded all year round. It is the thirsty man who meets the oasis. It is the only source of light to dispel the infinite darkness. The eldest lady is quiet. It's so quiet that I need to catch her seriously all the time. The first time she spoke to me was after the tutor gave us lessons. She looked at me nonchalantly. "Come here." I walked up to her and waited for her next word. She grabbed my wrist straight away. Her brows slightly furrowed, gradually stretched. After that day, I never saw the tutor again. Later, the eldest lady often asked me to reach out and hold it for her. I was puzzled, but I loved the feeling of her slender knuckles tightly enclosing my wrists. In addition to this, the eldest lady has many quirks. The most important one is that she doesn't like people touching her. As soon as someone touches her, she may lose her temper without warning. Except for me. But I can't actively touch her. But what's wrong with the eldest lady? I could clearly detect the servant's impatient look. Also knows that the boy who was smashed by the eldest lady, and his head was bleeding, is a notoriously rotten person. So I like to give the eldest lady the aftermath. For example, let the servant voluntarily resign because of endless unfortunate things. For example, on the way home, the boy was accidentally beaten by his former enemy. The eldest lady can't be wrong, isn't it? Later, the eldest lady's father brought back an illegitimate daughter. There were many guests that day, but he turned the eldest lady's birthday banquet into the return banquet of the illegitimate daughter. I looked at the curvature of the corners of the eldest lady's mouth that seemed to be smiling but not smiling. I was thinking that maybe I should speed things up and make Pansy's house fall a little faster. The illegitimate daughter may want to provoke and always do something to make the eldest lady unhappy. That night, I was touched by an illegitimate daughter on the wrist, and the eldest lady avoided my touch. At that moment, I hated to let that woman disappear completely. I could only wash my hands over and over again in a panic before I dared to see the eldest lady. I'm the eldest lady's doll, and if it gets dirty, it will be thrown away. But I have long been branded as a young lady. Leaving my master means that my life will be meaningless. I know Mr. Dorothy and his illegitimate daughter won't be bouncing for long. But I didn't expect that Dora Pansy would dare to lock the eldest lady in the utility room. The eldest lady has been afraid of the dark since she was a child, and she is also afraid of heavy rain. Every time I went to her room to accompany her and read to her, watching the eldest lady fall asleep peacefully to the sound of my reading, I was extremely satisfied. So when I saw the eldest lady curled up in the corner, her breath faint, even the anger dissipated, leaving only panic and distress. The eldest lady asked me if I would betray her. At that moment, I could hear her fragility and unease. The heart felt like it had been pierced by a dense needle. It hurt so much that I cried in her neck. Of course I won't betray the eldest lady. I can be a big lady's doll, her dog, her knife, always be by the side of the eldest lady. It can only be me by the eldest lady's side. I once watched a movie with the eldest lady. There is a line in it that I have remembered for a long time. What is love? Love is to take over, to destroy, and to destroy. In order to get the other party, he will do whatever it takes to make the other party sad, and if necessary, he will scatter in two and burn the jade. There was no love in the eyes of the eldest lady when she looked at me, but I still fell in love with her without hesitation. Maybe it was the first time the eldest lady shook my hand and took me back to Pansy's house. Maybe it's the first time I've eaten celery allergies, and I haven't seen celery on the table since. Maybe it was a birthday that I didn't even remember, but the eldest lady threw me a set with a cold face, and I paid attention to it for 2 more seconds. Of the book. Or maybe it's a person like her who seems to have a cold temperament, because others said that I had no father, no mother, no upbringing. They directly pressed the person into the sand. So you see, it is inevitable that Basil Maggie will fall in love with the eldest lady. So even if the eldest lady only sees me as her possession, I am willing to do it. We were in the empty basement that day. I listened to her speak in a calmer tone about a time I hadn't been a part of. It was torture that should never have happened to the eldest lady. I shuddered, suppressing the tremors in my heart. But in the next second, the eldest lady read what I was thinking. Every word is like a hammer pounding in my heart. Only then did I understand why the eldest lady didn't like others to touch her. Because she can see all the ugliness in her heart. The eldest lady will pick me up and hold my wrist. It's because I'm loyal enough. The eldest lady asked me if I was afraid. How could I be afraid? I trembled with excitement, and I felt nothing more than the blood burning my sanity. For a moment, the emotions of happiness, fear, and ecstasy are intertwined. Fortunately, the eldest lady has such ability. I was able to meet her, and I was always by her side. This is a gift that belongs to me alone, because I will never betray her. I will never be abandoned. There will be no one in this world who is more suitable for the eldest lady than me. What if the eldest lady doesn't understand love? If I'm willing to surrender, that possession and destruction is the embodiment of love. For the rest of her life, she could be sure countless times that I belong to her. The end.